Manchester United are known for sorry, wrong photo. Manchester United are known for being one of the biggest football clubs of all time, being home to many footballing legends as well as the greatest manager of all time. The club has dominated both England and Europe for decades now. But how did we get here? In the 1860s and 70s, football was rapidly becoming widespread across England, and in 1878, Manchester United Football Club was born. Except it wasn't. The name was Newton Heath LYR Football Club. During this time, pretty much all football clubs were set up by railway workers. Newton Heath was set up by Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, hence the LYR in the name. Initially, the team played against other departments and railway workers at the very first home ground at North Road. This was until Newton Heath were invited to join the Football Alliance in 1891. At the time, English football was split into two different leagues: the Football League, which was the first division, and the Football Alliance, which was the second division, with promotion and relegation being the same as it is today. The Football Alliance consisted of teams like Nottingham Forest, Small Heath, known as Birmingham City today, the Wednesday, now Sheffield Wednesday, Burton Swifts, now known as Burton Albion, Crewe Alexandra, Ardwick, who are now known as Manchester City, Bootle, who dissolved in 1893, Lincoln City, Grimsby Town, Waswell Town Swifts, now Waswell FC, and Birmingham St George's FC, who dissolved in 1892. In their first season, they managed to place second, just 2 points behind eventual winners Nottingham Forest. The next year, both the Football League and the Football Alliance merged to create the Football League. In their first season of the Football League, they came last, but somehow they managed to stay up. Don't ask. But don't worry, because the next season they came last again, this time actually getting relegated to the second division. During the early 1900s, United weren't in the best places. They had a pretty large debt and nearly went bankrupt, and the club would have completely dissolved if it wasn't for a dog. Yeah, a dog. Let me explain. The club decided to hold a 4-day bazaar in an attempt to raise some money in order to clear the debts. After it was finished, club captain Harry Stafford's dog escaped with a collection tin full of money. He managed to find his way to the local brewer John Henry Davies, whose daughter loved the dog so much that he decided to find out more about the collection tin. Both the dog and the tin were returned to the club and saved them from bankruptcy. Around a year after this whole incident, the same brewer, John Henry Davies, became the club president, and in his first week in charge, he managed to change the club's name from Newton Heath to the infamous Manchester United. But it wasn't as easy as that. He was about to name the club Manchester Celtic. Goodness, that one didn't happen. Through the early 1900s, their fortunes began to turn around, and in 1908, Manchester United won their first ever championship. This was mainly thanks to Man City being forced to sell most of their team due to a scandal they were involved in. Not the first time I've heard that one before. In 1910, they left their old stadium, Bank Street, due to the bad conditions and moved to the infamous Old Trafford, where they still are to this day. Throughout the next decade, there wasn't much that really happened. In the 1920s and 30s, there was a bit of back and forth between the first and second division, and in 1939, World War II broke out, leading to the suspension of all games. Old Trafford was bombed by the Germans, forcing them to move the main road, otherwise known as Manchester City Stadium, until 1949. But it wasn't until 1945 that things really started to kick off. World War II had just finished, leading to the managerial appointment of Matt Busby. You might have heard of him. Off the bat, he completely took authority over team selection, transfers and training sessions, as well as putting 7 star players up for transfer. This eventually paid off when Busby led the team to second place league finishes in both 1947 and 1948. They also won the FA Cup in 1948 after being Blackpool 4-2, claiming their first major trophy in 37 years. At the start of the next season, Busby began selling lots of their older players and replacing them with young reserve players. These group of players were regarded as the Busby Babes. You've probably heard of them before. These players were scouted by Joe Armstrong, the club's main scout at the time. He found gems like Bob Bishop, Dennis Violet, and most notably Duncan Edwards. The team was high-flying and won their first league title in 41 years. But they weren't done there, as in 1956 they won the league again by an 11-point margin. Following this, they were the first English club to participate in the European Cup. The next season was also pretty successful, as a young Bobby Charlton burst onto the scene, scoring 10 goals. The club beat Man City in the 1956 Charity Shield and got to the FA Cup final. However, they played without their main goalkeeper Ray Wood, leading to a 2-1 loss to Aston Villa. United's first European game was against Anderlecht. They managed a 2-0 win in Belgium, then proceeded to win 10-0 back in England. This is still their biggest win to date in a European game. They then went on to knock out both Borussia Dortmund and Athletic Bilbao before losing to Real Madrid in the semi-finals. But it wasn't until 1958 that things took a turn for the worst. On the 6th of February 1958, the team travelled to Yugoslavia to play Red Star Belgrade in a quarter-final game of the European Cup. The game finished 3-3, but as United already won 2-1 at home, they were supposedly through to the semi-finals of the Cup. The team got back onto the plane, which was being flown by pilot, captain James Thane, and co-pilot Kenneth Raymond. At 1:15 p.m, the plane landed in Munich for refueling. 2:19, the control tower at Munich was told the plane was ready to take off. However, Raymond abandoned takeoff after Thane noticing that the engine sounded odd when accelerating. A second attempt was made 3 minutes later, but it was called off 40 seconds into the attempt because the engine was running off an over-rich mixture, causing them to over-accelerate. After the second failure, the players returned to the airport lounge. By then, it was starting to heavily snow in Munich, and it looked practically impossible for the plane to continue the journey home. Duncan Edwards sent a telegram to his landlady back in England, simply saying, "All flights cancelled, flying tomorrow, Duncan." Thane told the station engineer Bill Black about the issue. He suggested that since the opening the throttle more slowly had not worked, the only choice was to keep the plane in overnight for repairs. But Thane was anxious as he didn't want United to miss their upcoming match, so he suggested opening the throttle even more slowly would suffice. The challenge is that the plane wouldn't take off until further down the runway, but with the runway being nearly 2 kilometers long, he believed it wasn't going to be a problem. So after only 15 minutes, the players and the staff were called back onto the plane, despite thinking that it wasn't going to be ready until the next day. 2:56 p.m. All the players and staff were on board, with Thane and Raymond getting the plane moving again. 2:59. They reached the runway holding point where they received clearance to line up ready for takeoff. 3:02. Final checks were made in the cockpit and they were ready to take off. However, they only had a 2-minute gap to do so. 3:03. They confirmed that they were going to take off to the control tower. The plane began to accelerate, throwing up slush as it began to speed up. Thane then called out the plane's velocity. The plane reached 80 knots. V1, he announced, at which it was no longer safe to abort. They had to commit. Raymond listened for the call of V2, meaning it was a speed of 119 volts, which was enough to lift it off the ground. 90. 100. 110. 117. 112. The speed dropped. Then to 105. The plane skidded off the runway, crashed into the fence surrounding the airport, and across the road before the wing was torn off as it caught a house. It was a race against time to escape before the plane exploded. The stewardesses Rosemary Cheverton and Margaret Bellis were the first to leave through the emergency window, as well as pilot, captain James Thane. Meanwhile in the cabin, goalkeeper Harry Gregg was regaining his consciousness. At first, he thought he was dead. "I didn't dare to put my hand up. I thought the top of my head had been taken off like a hard-boiled egg," he said after the incident. While regaining his consciousness, he saw a light above him. He manages to kick a hole wide enough for him to escape. He also manages to rescue teammates Bobby Charlton and Dennis Violet, who were strapped into their seats away from the wreckage. In total, 23 passengers died. Co-pilot Kenneth Raymond. 8 Manchester United players: Jeff Bent, Roger Bryan, Eddie Coleman, Mark Jones, David Pegg, Thomas Taylor, Billy Whelan, as well as Duncan Edwards. He at first survived the crash but died in hospital 15 days later. Club secretary Walter Crickmore, trainer Tom Curry, chief coach Bert Wally, as well as journalists Frank Swift and Donny Davies died in the crash. Two key players, Jackie Blanchflower and Johnny Berry, were critically injured and never played for the club again, in addition to manager Matt Busby being seriously injured. After the crash, Matt Busby was in hospital for 2 months, recovering from multiple injuries, with his chances of survival being no better than 50%. While Busby was in hospital, his assistant Jimmy Murphy took charge. The team greatly struggled as it was near fully made of reserve players, winning only 1 out of 14 matches after the Munich air disaster, putting them in 9th place by the end of the season. Despite their poor form, they managed to beat AC Milan at Old Trafford in the European Cup, only to lose 4-0 at the San Siro. Real Madrid went on to beat AC Milan that year, and Madrid suggested the idea of awarding Manchester United with the trophy that year, but the idea failed to materialise. After being discharged from hospital, Matt Busby travelled to the Swiss town Interlaken to rest. During his stay, he felt like giving up entirely, until his wife said to him, "You know, Matt, the lads would have wanted you to carry on." Little did she know that this one sentence would change the club forever. This statement single-handedly lifted Busby from his depression, and he returned back to Manchester to watch his team play the 1958 FA Cup final. Despite losing the final 2-0, Busby returned as manager for the next season. Throughout the next few seasons, several signings were made in an attempt to rebuild the squad, including Noel Cantwell, Maurice Setters and Dennis Law. He at the time broke the transfer record after United signed him for $115,000. However, after all these signings, United were in an even worse position. The team's form was very inconsistent, leading to finishing 19th place in the 62-63 season, despite winning the FA Cup the same year. After the crash, Matt Busby wanted to change the club's nickname. At the time, it was the Busby Babes, but Busby felt it was inappropriate, so he decided to change the name. He looked at English rugby club Salford, who were touring France wearing the red shirt and calling themselves the Red Devils. Busby liked the idea and declared Manchester United should be known as the Red Devils, with the club crest now being changed to a devil in the centre holding a pitchfork, and thus this was the birth of Manchester United as we know it. In 1961, Manchester United scout Bob Bishop was in East Belfast watching an under-16s football game, and there was one kid that caught his eye. Straight after the game, he telegrammed Matt Busby saying, "I think I found you a genius," and his name was George Best. He was given a trial and eventually signed by United's chief scout Joe Armstrong. He made his professional debut on the 14th of September 1963 against West Brom, and by the 63-64 season he was a regular starter alongside Dennis Law and Sir Bobby Charlton. This trio became known as the United Trinity and brought United back up to the top. United would go on to finish the next season second, and then won the league in the 1964-65 season. In that same season, United went on a run of 13 wins in 15 games. The rebuild was complete, with the United Trinity taking the league by storm, with all three of them winning the Ballon d'Or. Dennis Law in 64, Charlton in 66 and Best in 68. United won another league title in the 66-67 season, going unbeaten in their final 20 games and finishing the season off with a 6-1 win over West Ham, qualifying them for the European Cup the next season. Manchester United's 67-68 European run was one never to forget. It began with a comfortable 4-0 win against Maltese side Hibernians, then a rather tough 2-1 win against Bosnian side that team, followed by another rather 2-1 win against Polish side. I'm not even going to bother pronouncing that. They moved on to the semi-finals and faced Spanish giants Real Madrid. Man United managed to grab a 1-0 win at Old Trafford, but it wasn't a big advantage to take to the Bernabeu. Before the game, Dennis Law was suffering from a knee injury, so Busby decided to start 36-year-old defender Bill Fuchs. The game started poorly for United as Real Madrid dominated. They led 3-1 at half-time, or 3-2 at aggregate. All United needed were 2 goals to see them through. United fought back in the second half, but it wasn't until the 73rd minute until David Sandler managed to level the score. All they needed was one more goal, and then in the 80th minute George Best passed it to 36-year-old Bill Fuchs, who buried it into the bottom corner. They won the game 4-3 in aggregate and met Benfica in the final at Wembley. After a quiet first half, United fought hard in the second half, leading to Bobby Charlton opening the score in the 53rd minute. This was quickly matched as Benfica equalised in the 79th minute. Time was running out with the game being forced into extra time, and then In the 92nd minute, George Best did the unthinkable. He took the ball and dribbled it through the defence, ran the goalkeeper and scored. But United weren't done yet, because just 2 minutes later, 19-year-old Brian Kidd added another to the tally, and then in the 99th minute, Sir Bobby Charlton slotted another in to put the final nail in the coffin. The game finished 4-1 to United, and they were crowned as the European Cup winners for the first time in their history, with George Best being called El Beatle by the Portuguese media after one of the best performances of his career. But of course, all eras come with an end. With players like Bobby Charlton and Shay Brennan now in their early 30s, as well as Dennis Law in his late 20s, the squad was slowly aging, and thus, on the 14th of January 1969, after 1,120 games over a 24-year stint, 5 league titles, 2 FA Cups, 5 Charity Shields and a European Cup, Sir Matt Busby announced his retirement as Manchester United manager. And it's safe to say he is still remembered as one of the greatest managers in the club's history. After Sir Matt Busby's retirement, his assistant Wilf McGuinness was appointed as the club's first team manager, but it was a disaster. After an 8th place finish in their first season and a poor start to the 1970-71 season, he was sacked after only 18 months in charge. The 70s and 80s were filled with lots of different managers just trying to find that Busby replacement, but it was looking very unsuccessful. It got so bad that they reappointed Matt Busby for half the season just to get them out the relegation zone, which he managed to do with ease. During the early 70s, George Best became a big problem. Constantly partying and getting into trouble, this had a big impact on his career. And at the start of the 1971-72 season, he announced his retirement from football, being only 25 years old. However, he quickly changed his mind and returned to the Man United squad only 4 days later. This didn't stop him getting into trouble though. Best behaviour didn't help the club as it continued in a downward spiral. After the sacking of Wilf McGuinness, the club appointed former Leicester City manager Frank O'Farrell, but this went down as a lead balloon after a disastrous 9 games without a single win. They were planning to sack him, and after a 5-0 loss to Crystal Palace, he was sacked on the 19th of December 1972. During this time, all of Busby's players were seriously ageing, with Billy Foulkes retired, and both Bobby Charlton and George Best, again, announcing that they would retire at the end of the 72-73 season. A rebuild needed to happen, and it needed to happen fast. On the 22nd of December 1972, Scotland manager Tom Douchy joined United. Yeah, let's pause here a sec. Yes, I know it's not meant to be pronounced Douchy, and I know it's meant to be pronounced Doherty. I don't know why, but when I was recording it, I pronounced it as Douchy. So just endure it for about 2 minutes. Straight off the bat, he immediately began to rebuild the squad by making lots of prospect signings, as well as selling Dennis Law to Manchester City on a free transfer. Oh aye, and George Best reappeared for the 3rd time. However, despite the attempted rebuild, this ended up being the worst season ever at the club. United were caught in the relegation battle, and it came down to the final game of the season. United faced Manchester City, needing 1 win to stay up, and unfortunately they lost 1-0 after Dennis Law, out of all people, slotted a goal into the bottom corner, sending United to the 2nd division for the first time in 36 years. But fortunately, United managed to bounce back and return to the top flight the next season. Their run of form continued as they were sitting at the top of the 1st division by Christmas of the 75-76 season. That was until their form slipped in the second half of the season and managed to finish 3rd. Throughout the next 2 seasons, they did pretty well. Lots of new young players found their way into the team. The rebuild was really looking up for them. However, that all came to a halt when news broke of Tommy Douchy having an affair with Mary Brown, the wife of team physiotherapist Lawrence Brown. And after all this went down, the club knew things couldn't continue and he was therefore sacked. The club replaced him with Dave Sexton, who didn't really have an impact at the club, so we're not going to go through his time. He lasted a few years, then was sacked at the beginning of the 80-81 season. The search was on for a new manager, and after a bit of consideration, it was Ron Atkinson who got the job. Within his first few seasons, he broke the transfer record after signing Brian Robson from West Brom. for £1.5 million. But this paid off as Robson became the club captain and is still the longest serving captain ever, wearing the armband for 12 years. The club started the 81-82 season very strongly, bringing an attractive style of football to the club. He finished third in his first season. He also won the FA Cup final after a 4-0 win to Brighton, and although he got to the League Cup final for the first time ever, they lost 2-1 to Liverpool. They continued their momentum into the next season, starting by winning the Charity Shield after getting their revenge in a 2-0 win against Liverpool. And although being knocked out early in the FA Cup to 3rd Division side Bournemouth, they finished the season with a respectable 4th place. In the same season, Welsh striker Mark Hughes made his debut for the club and became a regular starter for him. He scored 24 goals in the following season, which earned him Young Footballer of the Year award. The club kept their consistent form throughout the next few seasons up until the 84-85 season. United started the season with 10 wins in a row and was a whopping 10 points clear in October. Everything was looking up for him until the new year, when their main man Brian Robson was sidelined for the rest of the season. This caused United's form to slump as they finished the season in 4th place. The next summer, the club also reluctantly sold Mark Hughes to Barcelona for $2 million after he developed a serious drinking addiction that was affecting his career at United. During this time, rumours started to circulate that Ron Atkinson would be sacked, but it remained a rumour as he still had a job by the start of the 86-87 season. The season started poorly for United with 3 straight defeats. They managed to pick up their first win during game week 5 when they won 5-1 against Southampton, but this was quickly short-lived as they went on to drop points against Watford, Everton, Chelsea, Coventry, and after this poor run of form, the club decided to sack Ron Atkinson. And lucky for them, they knew exactly who to replace him with.